Vietnam, it was your grandpa's Afghanistan. But we bet you didn't know these dirty secrets about the second greatest folly in U.S. war history. Number 1. The U.S. was winning. Vietnam remains singular in U.S. history as the one conflict where the United States snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. At almost every possible opportunity, the U.S. did all it could to not win the war. And despite this, it was still winning until the day it decided to pull out. By 1968, the war had ground to a stalemate, though really only because the U.S. wanted it to be a stalemate. Forbidden from taking and holding ground in North Vietnam due to miscalculated fears of Chinese and Soviet involvement, American ground forces were basically sitting in fortified areas while the countryside around them swarmed with guerrilla and NVA forces. Even so, the NVA couldn't make any progress in actually defeating South Vietnam, so both sides clashed occasionally as battle lines budged by a few hundred meters occasionally. The North knew that if it was going to win the war, it needed to split the U.S. off from its South Vietnam allies. The South Vietnamese government was a hodgepodge of despots and autocrats and wielded its military forces so ineptly that it stood little chance against the North on its own. The relationship between the U.S. and South Vietnam was severely strained, owing to the heavy lifting done by the U.S. troops in defense of the country, and the South Vietnamese government's sheer incompetence, corruption, and ineptitude. If the rapidly fraying ties of the alliance could be severed completely, the U.S. would leave the country and the North would win. In order to achieve this, NVA General Vo Nguyen Giap came up with a bold military attack, which would then become the famous Tet Offensive. The plan was simple. For the duration of the war, both North and South had observed an unofficial ceasefire during the January 31st Lunar New Year celebrations. With the South and its U.S. allies not expecting major military activity during the traditional ceasefire, the North would be able to launch a volley of surprise attacks across the countryside. The resulting chaos would dissolve the morale of the South Vietnamese army, a fighting force already perilously low on morale and discipline, and force the U.S. to abandon the South. Early in the morning of January 30th, 1968, Viet Cong forces under the command of the NVA attacked 13 cities in central South Vietnam. Many families and soldiers were preparing for the Lunar New Year, catching the South completely by surprise. As the South and U.S. forces reeled from the surprise attack, the North launched its own attacks against South Vietnamese cities, government targets, and joint U.S.-South Vietnamese military bases. The ferocity of the dual-pronged offensive rocked even battle-hardened U.S. forces on their heels. The most iconic moment of the Tet Offensive, and the moment it became clear for many Americans the war was lost, was when Viet Cong forces breached the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Journalists famously snapped many images which were quickly sent around the world, highlighting the brutality and hopelessness of the massive attack. There was just one problem with that narrative. The entire platoon of Viet Cong that assaulted the U.S. Embassy was annihilated by American forces. That story would repeat itself in over 120 enemy actions throughout the Tet Offensive, as U.S. and ARVN forces crushed the Viet Cong and their NVA allies. The North suffered massive casualties in the failed attacks, with the Viet Cong bearing a particularly grisly toll. The plan to collapse the demoralized South Vietnamese people had completely failed, and 0 strategic objectives were seized. It was an utter military disaster for the North, but the U.S. did its best to turn that disaster into one of the greatest victories of the 20th century. Newsreels of the fierce fighting showed dozens of dead U.S. troops to audiences back home. The Battle of Hue, which would last 3 weeks and be the fiercest battle of the Tet Offensive, saw 150 U.S. Marines killed alongside 400 South Vietnamese. News cameras were there to document the carnage. What audiences in the U.S. missed was that nearly 5,000 enemy forces had also been killed. Thanks to scenes like this, supplied with no context, the war, which seemed to finally be drawing down, was suddenly an unwinnable quagmire, and continued support for it was tantamount to political suicide. The North had failed at winning any military victory, but won the greater public opinion victory. In a bid to hasten along a peace deal, the U.S. limited bombing into North Vietnam, bombing campaigns which had unknowingly almost brought the North to the point of complete collapse. Just in time, though, the U.S. gave the North a much-needed lifeline and ensured it would live to fight another 5 years until the inevitable U.S. pullout. Number 2. The key to victory was not in Vietnam at all. After the war was officially over and the North was victorious, one Northern general was asked what his greatest fear was throughout the war. His answer? U.S. ground forces attacking the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was actually a mishmash of roads, footpaths, and unmarked trails that crisscrossed Laos and Cambodia, allowing North Vietnamese forces to slip into South Vietnam while avoiding U.S. forces completely. It also allowed for the critical reinforcing and resupply of the Viet Cong, with hundreds of tons of materials traversing the trail every month. The U.S. was fully aware of the existence of the trail but limited its attempts to interrupt it to small-scale raids and air power. With no ground forces to hold insecure territory, the thousands of bombs dropped by U.S. planes did little to stem the rushing tide of weapons and manpower into South Vietnam. Yet the U.S. was afraid of escalating the war should it use ground forces to secure the trail, and was already facing criticism for its use of air power outside of Vietnam's borders. These would have been perfectly valid complaints had North Vietnam not already escalated the war outside of Vietnam's borders. Instead of fighting the war that existed, the U.S. tried to fight the conventional war that it believed in and gave free rein to the North to resupply its forces and allies to the South. Number 3. The NVA was one of the few armies in history to lose most battles and still win the war. The NVA was a professional and well-trained fighting force, at the time fielding one of the largest armies in the world. Despite this, they lost nearly every battle they engaged in against U.S. forces. Superior U.S. equipment, tactics, air support, and training is part of the answer, but so is the low-quality equipment being mass-produced in China and provided to the North on the cheap. In the end, though, despite losing nearly every battle it engaged in, the NVA still won the war, without achieving any real military strategic objectives in 2 decades of fighting. Number 4. U.S. troops hated their rifles. When U.S. forces set foot in Vietnam in force, they were immediately overwhelmed by superior NVA firepower. The North was supplied with the infamous AK-47, which, while lacking in accuracy, was rugged, reliable, and could deliver an overwhelming amount of fire. The U.S., meanwhile, had failed to learn anything from World War II or Korea and brought along the M14 battle rifle, successor to the M1 Garand. The M14 was, in fact, a fine rifle. Its .7.62 round could penetrate even thick jungle cover to deliver a killing blow, and it was an extremely accurate rifle. However, it was completely uncontrollable in full auto mode and too large and unwieldy in a jungle environment. Its extremely limited magazine size in comparison to the AK-47s also gave the tactical advantage to the enemy, as well as the fact that the wooden stock of the rifle would swell and expand in the jungle moisture, adversely affecting accuracy. With U.S. troops completely outclassed in firepower, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara immediately approved the M16 as the new replacement for the M14. The M16 could not only match the AK-47 in volume of fire, but was lighter, more accurate, and easier to manufacture. Yet its first deployments to Vietnam were an immediate disaster. In order to reduce cost, McNamara had approved the use of an alternate gunpowder which hadn't been tested for jungle use. This caused the M16 to suffer frequent misfires, leaving soldiers weaponless in the middle of a battle. To further compound the disaster, the rifles had been billed as a self-cleaning gun, an absolute lunatic statement, but one that led to cleaning kits not being issued to soldiers. While the M16 eventually redeemed itself and became one of the world's best assault rifles, U.S. troops had so little confidence in their own weapons that they often pilfered the AK-47s from dead enemies. The weapon was actually preferred by U.S. Special Forces, who would often surprise enemy troops who wouldn't realize they were under enemy attack until it was too late. However, it also led to many friendly fire incidents as American and South Vietnamese forces fired on friendlies using an AK. Number 5. A fourth country matched and maybe even exceeded the U.S., South Vietnam, or North Vietnam in number of civilian massacres. Bring up the topic of massacres in Vietnam and you'll likely hear all about U.S. troops and events such as the Massacre of My Lai, where U.S. troops killed as many as 500 Vietnamese civilians. You might even hear about the Hue Massacre, where the Viet Cong killed up to 6,000 U.S. and South Vietnamese government supporters. What you likely won't hear about is the country that committed an estimated 80 massacres and had over 300,000 troops fighting alongside the U.S. The Republic of South Korea saw a communist Vietnam as an imminent threat right in its own backyard and was quick to lend aid to the U.S. effort to defeat the North. To that end, it would send over 300,000 soldiers to assist the coalition during the fighting. But ROK forces quickly grew a bad reputation amongst U.S. leadership for their treatment of civilians. Less scrupulous American commanders, however, endorsed the ROK's rough tactics, and overall, U.S. leadership worked to help cover up South Korean massacres, both out of a sense of practicality and ensuring the continued help of an ally, And because an investigation into South Korean troops massacring civilians would no doubt also bring attention to the US massacres. An estimated 8,000 to 9,000 civilians died at the hand of South Korean forces, and not as collateral damage but as outright massacres. That figure might make South Korea the largest perpetrator of civilian massacres in the conflict, with the Viet Cong giving them a fair run for their money. Today, while South Korea has never formally acknowledged the massacres, it has spent millions in aid grants to Vietnam, with areas where South Korean troops committed known massacres receiving significantly greater funds. Number 6. The U.S. faked its way into the war. On August 2, 1964, an American destroyer, the USS Maddox, was performing routine signals intelligence patrols off the coast of Vietnam. North Vietnamese forces were on high alert due to raids by South Vietnam in the region. Upon spotting the Maddox, she was shadowed by North Vietnamese torpedo boats, with intercepted radio chatter indicating the boats were preparing to attack. The Maddox changed course and accelerated, but the torpedo boats sped up to match course and speed. As the boats neared, the Maddox fired 3 warning shots, landing splashes in the water in front of them. That's when the boats loosed a volley of torpedoes, which the Maddox easily avoided. In response, the Maddox opened fire with its 5-inch guns, hitting one and forcing the other boats away. A nearby patrol of F-8 Crusaders responded to the Maddox's location, sinking one of the torpedo boats and severely damaging a second. 2 days later, Maddox and Turner Joy returned to the area in a show of force. The 2 American vessels were immediately attacked by North Vietnamese ships, prompting a 4-hour battle that resulted in 2 sunk torpedo boats. The attacks would prompt President Lyndon Johnson to ask for and receive authorization to enter the war in Vietnam, as well as take any necessary action to halt the expansion of communism in Southeast Asia, infamously known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. There was just one problem. The second incident, which spurred the U.S. to war, never happened. Both the Maddox and the Turner Joy had in fact engaged in a 4-hour gunfight on the 4th of August 1964, but they were firing on ghosts, despite the official account relayed back to Fleet Headquarters and then to the White House indicating the visual radar and sonar contacts, which were then engaged and destroyed. A closer investigation revealed that nobody on the Maddox had ever actually acknowledged a visual sighting on an enemy vessel. Further, bad weather was believed to be responsible for the fake radar contacts that the Maddox and Turner Joy took to be enemy ships, and anxious sonar operators most likely mistook natural contacts for North Vietnamese vessels. A laundry list of mistakes that sent the U.S. into a disastrous war, except many in both the U.S. government and military suspected that the second attack never actually took place. One senator even asked for time to verify the data received from the Maddox and the account of the battle, but all warnings were ignored. Johnson was actively looking for a reason to get into Vietnam out of fear of the equally infamous domino theory, which stated that if one nation fell to communism in Southeast Asia, the rest would quickly fall as well. In 2003, former Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara, possibly one of the most infamous men to ever hold the title, admitted that the second attack never happened. Whether he knew this or not on August 5, 1964, as the U.S. prepared to enter its second most disastrous war, is still unknown, but highly likely. Now go watch soldiers encounter mysterious monsters in Vietnam War, or click this other video instead.